Good morning. This is
Being
Kenneth
recorded.
with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here today with Maren Christensen, the Executive Director of the Multicultural Autism Action Network. How are you doing today, Maren?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking. I'm so excited to have you here today because, as many people know, we have the Advancing Equity Coalition has put out a set of policy priorities for people to be paying attention to in this year's school board race. And one of those issues is special education. And so we really wanted to have someone to have this conversation with us to really help our listeners and everybody learn more about special education and what are some of the things that folks should be thinking about and asking candidates as they're vying for a seat on the school board to govern our school district for the next 4 years. And so with everything happening in special education, and I'm not sure like people really have a clear sense of what is going on in special education right now, I'm super excited to have you join us, Maren. And yeah, I thought it would be great if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and kind of tell your story around why this issue is so important to you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity. And as you know, this is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. I am the parent of a student with a disability, and I'm a resident of Minneapolis. In the interest of full disclosure, I will say that my child is not currently enrolled in Minneapolis public schools. Like many families in Minneapolis, we would like nothing better than to send our child to the community school that is just a couple blocks from our house. But we've been in and out and in and out and in again of Minneapolis public schools. And basically, the bottom line was, that the options before us really weren't set up to serve our child very well. My son is autistic. He's a person with a lot of sensory processing differences. And for him, simply the act of stepping in the door of a classroom can feel really overwhelming. And many of the models that were offered to us were really focused on changing his behavior so that he would act in a way that would fit with the classroom model. And there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about how do we change this classroom to make a place where all students can succeed. So at the moment, we're not enrolled in Minneapolis public schools, but feel really passionately about public education. And as for our organization, the Multicultural Autism Action Network was founded by parents of children with disabilities from our multicultural communities. We primarily serve Somali and Oromo families in the Twin City area. And we provide Oromo and Somali language support groups. We provide a lot of parent education and empowerment. We also do a lot of one-to-one support. So if a family of a child with a disability wants someone to go with them to an IEP meeting or a doctor's office or an assessment or something like that, we'll provide that service. And I think we've probably been, I want to say, in close to maybe 50 IEP meetings in the past school year. So this is something that is very near and dear to our hearts. And we're really close to this issue about special education, especially in Minneapolis public schools.
Yeah. And so I just really quickly wanted to highlight, you mentioned the acronym of the Multicultural Autism Action Network. Can you share that? I thought that's just such a interesting and powerful nugget. So
yeah, absolutely. So the organization is Multicultural Autism Action Network, and the acronym is MAAN or MAN, and that is the Somali word for mind. So that's where the name comes from.
that's beautiful. That's really cool. So I'm super happy to have this conversation with you. I'm really excited, mainly because, so often when we talk about special education and really when the school board talks about special education in Minneapolis, it's often just talked about as we don't have enough money. We talk about the underfunding of special education. We talk about the bill back and the tuition billing and all that type of stuff, which are chronic issues for Minneapolis public schools that need to happen. But the board has so much more responsibility when it comes to the oversight of how the district is providing special education services to students with disabilities. And so I'm really excited to really get into some of these conversations with you. And so I know one of the top issues in Minneapolis public schools is how the district utilizes its federal setting levels for special education students and how segregated some special education students are in the district. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and explain that issue to us as why is that such a big issue, and especially what does that disproportionality that happens mean for Black and brown students in Minneapolis public schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for asking that question because it's a really important one. And I think it's one that really doesn't get a lot of attention. This is getting a little bit deep into the weeds here, but I'll do my best to just kind of explain it in simple terms. So our special education services are governed by the federal law called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And as part of that, we define what are called these federal settings, and we basically kind of put students in different buckets depending on how much time they spend with their non-disabled peers. So a student in federal setting 1, for example, would spend very little time in a segregated setting. A student in federal setting 2 would
Sorry,
spend.
really quick. When you say segregated setting, even like what does that mean?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So segregated setting means away from non-disabled peers, like a separate classroom, a resource room, a room where the students in that room are primarily people with disabilities,
Okay.
not being included with the rest of their classmates who are children without disabilities. So
Okay.
that's what we mean when we say segregated.
Great.
Yeah, so the federal setting 2 would be kids that need a slightly higher level of support that spend somewhere between 20 to 60% of their day in a segregated setting or with their disabled peers rather within the general ed student population. And then a federal setting 3 is a higher level of support. Again, those are students that are more segregated from their general education peers. And then there's also a federal setting 4, which is a completely separate facility, usually, often an enclosed school. In Minneapolis Public Schools, Riverbend and Harrison are the 2 schools that are serving children in federal setting 4. And I think, the reason this is so important is because, the science of education tells us that kids with disabilities have better outcomes when they are included with their non-disabled peers. This is, a well accepted fact. But our practice is often to segregate students, to take them away from the general education population. And that becomes especially difficult, when we're in a situation like we are right now with teacher shortages, because when we're isolating students, we need to provide a lot higher level of support. So it makes more difficult to serve those needs. And I think where this becomes even more important is when you look at the numbers in Minneapolis public schools that show very clearly that Black and Brown students are disproportionately segregated in those higher federal setting levels than their white and Caucasian peers. And that's troubling. And that I think if more people understood that fact and looked at that data, hopefully people would be pretty upset about that because it is clearly not serving our students well.
So just to recap, just so that I make sure I'm understanding, right, is which we know, like for example, Harrison is like 98% Black, right? And so Harrison is a segregated setting in North Minneapolis. And we know when the science of education, actually inclusion is what supports student outcomes the most. But Minneapolis Public Schools has a practice of having students in a separate facility that is almost exclusively Black. And we know that this is not actually serving students. And they're being left out from other education activities because of the setting and the facility that they are in. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to what I was talking about a little bit in my own introduction, is that often when a school, doesn't know how to serve a student, the sort of default is we'll put them in a more restrictive setting. It's not asking the questions of how do we include the student, how do we serve them in an inclusive setting, but rather it's just we're going to put them over here in this other location, this other setting, because we don't know how to serve their needs.
So we have a couple other topics that I want to touch on, but I just have one more quick question about this, and maybe it's not quick. So you're saying that Minneapolis could do something different than what they are doing, like, because you started this conversation or this topic off with this is the federal law that kind of outlines how these settings should work, right? And you said federal or setting 4 is like an exclusive facility. Um, so, but could Minneapolis public schools do it differently?
Absolutely, absolutely. And let me just give you one very concrete example. So, well, I can think of two off the top of my head that are very clear examples of this. One was a student who would elope on a regular basis, and that's kind of the fancy word for run away from the school.
Okay.
This is a student who felt overwhelmed, really didn't feel like they had a great support system in their school. And this is a community school in Minneapolis. So that kid would take off and they would run and they would, run out of the building. And in one case, ran very close to a busy street as I think a second grader. And that could have had some really poor outcomes. And the solution that the school proposed was we need to move this child to a federal setting 4, a very segregated setting. The solution wasn't, let's ask why this kid is eloping. Let's ask what is happening in this classroom that makes this child feel like they need to, run away from the school. What needs are not being met? Another example of this is a student that we worked with who was a sensory seeker. That means this is an autistic child that really tries to get a lot of physical input to meet, their body's need to feel regulated in space. So one of the things that this kid would do was often give people a huge bear hug. And when he would do that, he was a little kid, so he'd grab people by the legs. And I believe on one instant, somebody fell over when they did this unexpectedly. And again, this was interpreted as this kid is violent, this kid is attacking people, this kid needs to go to a federal setting for school. And this particular instance was, I think, really problematic because the parent didn't understand that that was what was happening. This is a parent who doesn't speak English as their first language, and they didn't understand that they had to specifically reject that part of their child's IEP or individualized education program in order to prevent that change from happening. And so that was never really communicated to the parent. This child was sent to the federal setting 4 school and then spent 2 years trying to get their kid out of there. And I just think that doesn't serve the child, that doesn't serve the family. It really doesn't serve the district either, because it's a very expensive, solution to the problem. I think what we should be doing is asking, what's really going on with this kid? What need is not being met? How can we change the environment here so that the kid has access to, like a big stuffed animal or something they can squish, or, maybe they need some occupational therapy to help them regulate their body. I think there are other solutions that we can offer rather than just looking at segregation as the answer to what are considered behavioral problems.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me and helps me also better understand this process. So, going into, you talked a little bit about like some of the teacher shortages, but you also talked a little bit about learning recovery and like, what are the actual, like, what is the science of education for students and all that stuff. And we know that students with disabilities have been very isolated throughout the pandemic. And even into the last school year that was pretty interrupted for several reasons. And so can you talk a little bit about, what are some of the academic outcomes that we're seeing for students with disabilities right now in Minneapolis public schools? And then, what type of issues are coming up in terms of learning recovery for the students, and what were students with disabilities really experiencing during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So, a lot of students really struggled to make things work during the pandemic and during distance learning. And we know that was difficult for a lot of people. But I think especially our students with disabilities and especially our students from communities of color, I think we're more impacted by this than many other folks. And we see that in the data that came out recently. We had the Mca Test Scores that came out. And if that is not a clarion call to every adult in the state that we have a serious problem, I don't know what is. Again, the data showed that our Black and Brown students are really hurting in terms of the number of students that are meeting expectations in reading and math. And again, for students with disabilities, the scores were really problematic. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I think it was something around 17%. of students with disabilities were meeting grade level expectations. So we know what we were doing in the past was not working. And I want to be clear that, that is not the result of lack of effort. A lot of teachers and administrators were working really hard to try and provide some options that would work for students with disabilities. But at the end of the day, in many cases, it just simply didn't. So there is an educational debt that is owed to these students. We know, again, under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that students have a right to a free, appropriate public education, and they have not received that in many cases during the pandemic. So we need to talk about, how we're going to serve those students. And I think that's one of the reasons that, some of the memos that came out from Minneapolis Public Schools this past summer were so problematic. We saw, the memo that came out that said all students receiving extended school year services in federal setting 3 were just going to be moved from in-person to distance learning. And that's problematic for many reasons, but I think the most important one is that is a model that didn't work for these kids the first time around. So what has changed that makes it think, we're going to be able to make up for what was lost doing the same thing that didn't work the first time? It's also problematic because, our system is based on providing individual solutions so to make kind of a blanket statement and apply it to all students in a particular class is also problematic. And it also left families really in the lurch with very little time to make plans for how to care for their students during that time. It makes assumptions about a parent's ability to sit with their student and provide support to them while they're doing distance learning. So there's all kinds of, questions about that are really uncertain. And I think some of the other communications have just made parents feel very confused. It certainly hasn't done much to rebuild lost trust. So I think we have a lot of work to do in that area.
And so, what's the possible solution to learning recovery? I mean, I guess, I don't know if there's one totally figured out, but how do we start to pay back that educational debt that we owe special education students in Minneapolis Public Schools?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question. And I don't think there's any easy and obvious answers to it. But I think one of the things that we should explore, and that was, suggested by some parents was, let's look at third-party providers. I sat in a number of IEP meetings with families where they specifically asked, my kid didn't meet these goals. Could we send them to a camp to, get those needs met? Could we work with a private tutor? Could we get some extra hours with an occupational therapist they see, outside? If the school district isn't able to deliver those services, then let us work with someone who can. So that's one thing I think we should explore. I think the other big piece that kind of ties into this is the so-called teacher shortage, and I say so-called because if you look at the numbers, it's not that we don't have enough licensed special education teachers in Minnesota. That is not the problem. The problem is that only about 50% of the teachers who hold a special education license are currently teaching in the classroom. And I think we need to ask ourselves why. I think it's not that there aren't teachers, it's that there's a mismatch between, the jobs that are being offered and the conditions under which people are willing to accept those jobs. So we need to tie those two together. And that's something that, is really a decision of the school board. That's a resource question. It's not a supply question.
So, yeah. So if you could say more about that, I'm really curious. What does that mean when you say there's the mismatch between the jobs that are being offered and then the conditions? What is that mismatch, if you don't mind being a little bit more specific to what you know?
That is a really good question. And I don't know of anybody who's specifically been, researching this from an academic standpoint, but certainly, we hear a lot about teacher pay. Yeah. We hear a lot about working conditions. We hear a lot about lack of support staff. We hear a lot about, the time that teachers need to spend on prep and being asked to do that in little snippets, 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, which really doesn't lend itself to the kind of thoughtful process that, any parent would want their child's
Mhm.
teacher to engage in.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of ways that we can improve those conditions. We know, that other districts are facing similar questions about staffing. But we also know that we have a lot of people leaving the profession. And again, I think it's really incumbent on us to ask why.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been great, Marin. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, I have two more questions for you. The first question is, as a voter who cares deeply about equity, education justice, wants to see debts owed be paid, if I'm thinking about who I want to support for school board, what are the things that you could recommend that I'm thinking about, asking about, talking about?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And of course, this is one, that's really near to my heart. I think, bringing up those questions about special education, bringing up those questions about disproportionality, bringing up those questions about our discipline systems and exclusion and restraint and suspensions and expulsions and how those affect the disability community and our students of color, and especially our students with intersecting identities. Like, let's ask those tough questions. I think also listening how our school board candidates are talking about inclusion and what is their vision for that? What is their understanding for that? How up to speed are they on these questions about the federal sendings, and do they understand that context? And is it a priority for them to do something about it? I think those are all kind of questions that are on my mind.
Awesome. And then my last question for you is, how can families who want to learn more about special education in Minneapolis Public Schools and how the district is serving students with disabilities, like what tools, ways can you help them just learn more, just to be allies and to be supportive of like all this important work that has to be done?
That is such a great question, and I really appreciate you asking it. I will admit that I grew up in the era when disability was something that we really didn't talk about. If someone was different, or if there was something, way a person moved in the world or thought, if their body was different, the polite thing to do was just not say anything and kind of ignore it. And that is something that I really needed to unlearn. So I would encourage other families to do the same and to have conversations with your children about students with disability in their classroom. Are they there? Are they participating? Are they coming along on the field trip? Are they in the lunchroom with you? Are they in the school play? Just normalizing those conversations and really talking with people with disabilities about, what their needs and what inclusion looks like to them. I think that those are conversations that any family can have, and I would really encourage them to do so.
Awesome. Well, this is a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much, Marin. I learned so much. I believe so many people will learn so much. So remember, special education is such an important issue and something that the school board has to govern over and has oversight over in Minneapolis Public Schools. So do not neglect to ask your school board candidates and your current school board members around what are their thoughts on all the topics that Mara and I discussed today, and like how the district ultimately is serving students with disabilities. And also, don't forget, we have AEC has a full policy platform and full set of priorities that we encourage everybody to be looking into, that include special education, academics, multilingual learners, student well-being, teachers of color, and financial management, right? And so that's 6 big topics. They're a lot, they're meaty. We're going to continue to put out resources for you all to learn more about all of these things, and for you to continue to ask candidates about all these things, because this school board election is crucial for the future of Minneapolis Public Schools. Thank you so much for your time, Marin. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for having this important conversation. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes. Have a great rest of your day.